the kind of cold that burns, you already know. But there is another kind, one that doesn't sting, that doesn't hurt, a cold that simply shuts things down. And when Thomas notices that his fingers have stopped throbbing, he understands it's not relief, it's the beginning of the end. Outside, the snow is already past the knee. The trails are gone. The oxen are dying one by one. And Eliza looks at him with a silence that weighs more than any accusation. Because it was him. He was the one who said the shortcut was the right choice. It is October of 1846. They should already be in California. But instead they are trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains, with food for only a few days and a winter that shows no sign of ending. And the question Thomas can't stop hearing inside his head, the only question that really matters now, is how far someone is willing to go to keep their children alive. If this already feels real, subscribe now, because what comes next won't feel like a story anymore. It will feel like a choice. Thomas's hands have known wood for 15 years, the smoothness of the grain, the damp smell of sawdust, the precise sound of a chisel cutting through a dry plank. But for months those hands haven't touched a single tool. They hold reins, push stuck wagons, patch whatever breaks along the road to a place called California, where they say the land is fertile and winter doesn't really exist. That's why he left everything behind in Springfield, the workshop, the clients, the house where Samuel was born, and convinced Eliza to follow him on this journey. The summer of 1846 was long and dusty, stretching across plains that never seemed to end. The caravan was large at the beginning, dozens of families moving together, each carrying their belongings and their hopes with the same tired determination. Thomas liked the nights when they camped and talked around the fire, sharing maps and speculating about what lay beyond the mountains. Those were the moments when he felt part of something bigger than himself. Then came the news about Hastings' shortcut, a guide who claimed it could cut nearly 400 kilometers from the route. A new trail that few had attempted but that, according to Hastings himself, was safe and passable. Thomas read the letter carefully, studying the numbers the way a carpenter studies a measurement, wanting them to make sense, wanting them to be precise. For 100 kilometers less meant arriving before winter, meant having enough time to settle, to build shelter, to prepare for whatever came next. Eliza was cautious, she always had been. It was part of what he admired about her, that ability to see what he sometimes preferred to ignore. But Thomas had his arguments ready, others were going, the season was advancing, staying on the longer route meant risking the winter anyway. Samuel was excited about arriving sooner, like any 8-year-old would be about a destination beyond the horizon. And deep down Thomas wanted to believe he had made the right decision, that California was the future, that the effort would be worth it. The group that chose Hastings' shortcut formed its own caravan, a little over 80 people, a number that seemed large enough to face the unknown. The first days were manageable, the trail did exist, and Thomas kept moving forward with that familiar feeling of building something from the ground up, step by step. But the Salt Lake Desert was nothing like the map suggested. It was wider, harsher, more unforgiving. The animals suffered. Some wagons had to be abandoned, and the time the shortcut was supposed to save began slipping away like fine sand. Weeks turned into months, and when the group finally reached the base of the Sierra Nevada, the calendar already said October. Thomas looked at the mountains ahead, massive, silent, indifferent, and for the first time felt something he couldn't quite name. They were late, not catastrophically. There was still time, still a narrow window before winter closed the passes. But that window was smaller than it should have been, and the wind coming down from those peaks carried something different. Something unfamiliar, something a deeper part of him was already starting to understand. That night, Eliza slept with her back turned to him. Samuel snored softly on the other side of the wagon, and Thomas lay awake staring at a sky without stars, listening to the wind coming down from the mountains like a warning that had arrived too late. The first storm came on the night of October 28th, and it came like a sentence. Thomas was awake when the first flakes began to fall. At first it almost looked beautiful, that soft white drifting down over the pines, covering the ground as if the world was being erased and written again. But the snow didn't stop. It fell for hours, then for days, piling up with a speed that didn't feel natural, that felt deliberate, as if the mountain had decided to close its doors, and there was nothing a group of 80 people could do about it. The attempt to cross the pass failed. Thomas was among those who tried, pushing through the snow with other men, feeling every step like a struggle against something that had no face and no intention. but was completely relentless. In some places, the snow reached shoulder height. The animals refused to move, and the horizon above never seemed to get closer no matter how far they walked. When they realized they wouldn't make it, the silence that followed wasn't immediate defeat. It was the silence of people beginning to understand what was happening to them. They set camp on the edge of Truckee Lake, which would soon be known by another name. The men cut down trees and built cabins with whatever they had: raw wood, hides, packed earth. Thomas worked with a focus he hadn't felt in months. His hands finally useful again, measuring and fitting with the muscle memory his craft had carved into him. There was something almost comforting about building, about creating order inside chaos, but the cabin he built was too small, too cold, and he knew it with every wall he finished. Food started being rationed in the second week. Thomas did the calculations carefully, the way he had learned to measure wood and materials, looking at the numbers honestly without optimistic rounding. What they had wasn't enough for an entire winter. Not even close. The animals were slaughtered one by one to feed the group, but even that was limited, and the cold preserved the bodies but didn't solve the shortage. Each meal was smaller than the last, and Thomas watched Samuel staring at his plate with the kind of expression children have when they still believe adults will fix everything. Eliza didn't complain, and that was what weighed the most. She simply adjusted in silence, making things last, doing what she could with what little they had. Sometimes Thomas would find her praying in a voice so low it was almost impossible to hear, and he respected that space without knowing if it was faith or just the need to have something the snow couldn't take away. They spoke about what was necessary and avoided the rest, that space between them filled with unspoken fears and accusations, like a room no one dared to enter. By the end of November, a second storm arrived, even stronger. The wind whistled through the cracks of the cabins with a persistence that felt personal. Samuel stopped asking when they would reach California. Not because he didn't want to know, but because he had learned to read in the adults' faces that some questions should not be asked out loud. Thomas noticed this change in his son with a weight in his chest unlike anything he had ever felt, deeper than fear, older than guilt. At night, when the fire died down and the frozen silence filled the cabin, Thomas lay awake listening to Eliza and Samuel breathing, counting each breath like a debt he owed. Outside, the snow kept falling, and the mountains that were supposed to be the path had become the prison. December arrived carrying a different kind of silence, no longer the silence of waiting, but the silence of people beginning to accept. The first to die were the weakest, the elderly, the youngest children, those whose bodies simply had nothing left to burn. Thomas helped carry the bodies, burying them in the snow where the frozen ground made real graves impossible, and every time he did it he felt something harden inside him, like wood that dries too much and cracks from within without showing it on the surface. That same month, the group formed what they called the Snowshoe Party. 15 people who would try to cross the mountains on foot with improvised snowshoes to reach Sacramento and bring help. Thomas was invited, but one look at Samuel was enough for him to refuse without hesitation. He wouldn't abandon the only reason any of this still made sense. Eliza said nothing when he told her, but she touched his arm for a brief moment, the first real contact they had shared in days, and Thomas felt it, like a full sentence neither of them could say out loud. Those who stayed watched the 15 disappear into the snow. Thomas stood in front of the cabin until their figures vanished among the trees, then went back inside without knowing if he had just watched hope leave or people choosing a different way to die. Weeks later, rumors began to spread about what that group had gone through, things the survivors refused to describe in detail. Thomas didn't ask. There are questions that once answered cannot be undone. By the end of December, the food was truly gone. Nothing could be called a real meal anymore, only whatever could be found, boiled, scraps of leather and bones from animals long gone that could still produce a tasteless broth. Thomas noticed Samuel sleeping more than he was awake, and he recognized that heavy sleep for what it was, the body shutting down when there is nothing left to fuel it, conserving, enduring however it can. It wasn't illness. It was the body being more honest than any decision the adults had made. One afternoon, the first rumor was spoken openly among the adults, without hesitation. Thomas heard it from a man named Foster, whose eyes had already lost that last layer of hope people carry when they believe there is still a way out. What Foster said was logical in the most brutal way possible. The dead needed nothing, and the living needed everything. The logic was clear, and exactly because of that, it was unbearable, and Thomas knew it wouldn't disappear just because no one wanted to. Accept it. That night, Thomas stepped outside and stood in the snow for a long time, looking at a winter sky clear of clouds and full of stars. He thought about Springfield, about his workshop, the smell of sawdust, the simplicity of a life that once seemed too small. He thought about the map, the promise of a shortcut, and the words he had told Eliza, "It's the right choice." Those words kept repeating in his mind with a force that neither cold nor hunger nor time could erase. When he went back inside, Eliza was awake. She looked at him for a long moment, and Thomas understood she had heard it too, that she was standing at the same silent edge, trying to understand where the line exists between what someone is capable of doing and what someone should never do. Neither of them spoke because their words would have been nothing more than noise over a silence that already said everything. January of 1847 became the longest month of Thomas's life. There was no way to measure time the way it used to be. The sun rose and set over a white landscape that never changed. The hours blurred together, and the only thing that marked each day was the mental count he made every morning. Who was still breathing, what was left to eat, how much firewood remained. It was a miserable calculation, but it was the only one that mattered. Samuel fell ill in the second week of January. Nothing dramatic, just a cough, a low fever, that pale look of someone whose body no longer has enough energy to stay warm. Thomas placed his hand on the boy's forehead and understood what the cold was saying without words. He stayed awake the entire night beside him, feeding the fire with whatever wood he had left, refusing sleep as if sleeping meant giving up. Eliza took care of Samuel during the day with a quiet, unsettling efficiency, doing what she could with almost nothing. One time Thomas found her crying with her face turned to the wall, her shoulders shaking without sound, and he didn't know what to do except stay there, without touching, without speaking, just present in that shared space where despair no longer needed words. There was a kind of intimacy there deeper than anything they had lived before, the intimacy of two people facing the same abyss. The others were in different stages of collapse. Some still tried to maintain routines, gathering wood, checking traps that rarely caught anything, fixing whatever could still be fixed. Others had stopped completely, lying still and staring at the wooden ceiling as if waiting for something or simply for the end. And sometimes those two things were the same. Thomas tried to remain among those still moving, but he knew the line between them was thinner than it looked. By mid-January, the truth of what some had done to survive became impossible to ignore. Thomas knew, and didn't ask how. Things like that don't need to be spoken. They move through silence, through glances, through portions that appear without explanation. That knowledge settled inside him like a stone that would not dissolve, and he wondered, without finding an answer, what he would have done if it had been Samuel, if it had been Eliza, if that had been the only option, and the answer kept changing depending on when he asked himself. At the end of January, a break in the darkness, one of the rescue parties finally reached the camp, and the news spread between the cabins faster than anything had in weeks. Thomas heard the shouting and didn't believe it at first. He had learned to distrust hope, because in those mountains hope rarely lasted. But the faces were real, the food was real, and for the first time in months he felt something that resembled possibility. But the rescue wasn't for everyone. There were only enough men and supplies to take part of the group. The children first, then the weakest, those who could no longer walk. Thomas placed Samuel into the arms of one of the rescuers with a feeling he couldn't separate. Relief because his son was leaving. Fear because it meant separation. Eliza went with him and Thomas stayed behind, waiting for the next rescue, watching the footprints in the snow that marked their path, still visible already, beginning to disappear beneath the snow that never truly stopped. The second rescue party arrived in February. By then the camp had been reduced to a number Thomas preferred not to count. Out of more than 80 people who had reached the lake in early November, nearly half had died from hunger, from cold, from exhaustion, from illnesses their bodies could no longer fight. Thomas left with the remaining survivors on a gray morning without looking back, carrying everything that had happened there like a scar, invisible on the outside, permanent on the inside. The journey through the mountains with the rescuers was brutal in a different way. Not the still desperation of the camp, but the constant physical strain of weakened bodies trying to cross distances that once would have been simple. Thomas fell, stood up, kept moving, the rescuers were efficient and compassionate. But in their eyes there was something he recognized, the effort of people trying not to imagine what had truly happened in those cabins during the winter, because some things are easier left unnamed. They reunited in Sacramento at the beginning of March. Thomas found Eliza and Samuel in a makeshift camp by the river, and their embrace was not cinematic, just two exhausted bodies holding on to each other, and a child who had regained some weight, looking at his father with eyes that still trusted, still believed, still didn't know the weight of certain stories. Thomas rested his head on Eliza's shoulder longer than necessary, breathing her in, trying to remember who he had been before. October of 1846. California was exactly what they had been promised: green, generous, vast. But Thomas arrived there as someone who had crossed something that never truly leaves, as if the destination had lost part of its meaning along the way. He found work as a carpenter in Sacramento, built a small solid house with his own hands, taught Samuel how to use a chisel with a patience he didn't have before, and life slowly began to rebuild itself, piece by piece, knowing it would never be exactly the same. What never returned was the lightness. There were nights, especially in winter, when the wind hit the windows harder, and Thomas would wake up hearing that white silence from the mountains, feeling in his fingers a cold that didn't hurt, lying there awake waiting for his body to remember he was no longer there. Eliza never asked what he had seen in those final days before the rescue, and he never told her, not to hide it, but because some things cannot be carried by words without breaking them. The story of the Donner Party spread quickly. Books, reports, investigations. Thomas read some of them later. He recognized the events but not the people. The stories turned ordinary families into something distant, something between tragedy and horror, and in that transformation what had really happened was lost. Ordinary people making ordinary decisions, searching for a better life, and meeting a winter that had no reason to wait for them. Years later, on an April afternoon, Thomas was working in the yard when Samuel, older now, came to ask about the journey to California. He had heard something at school. Someone had mentioned the name Donner, and he wanted to know if his father knew that story. Thomas stopped, looked at the piece of wood in his hands for a long moment, then looked at his son, said he did, said it had been hard, said that sometimes the choices that seem right aren't, and that doesn't change the fact that life keeps forcing you to choose with incomplete information. Samuel listened quietly, still trusting, and Thomas returned to his work, to the hands that knew wood, to the smell of sawdust, the only place where he could still feel whole.